Well, welcome to this tremendous panel we have now on emerging markets. I want to introduce each of them, not just by their job titles, but how much they've traveled just this year. So you understand the level to which these folks have an understanding of what's going on the ground in the world. Dominic Barton of McKinsey has been on a plane 300 days out of the past 365 days, and he has visited approximately 50 countries. John Rice, Vice Chairman of GE, I think we decided it was the same. 300 days and at least 50 countries, would you say?
I would say 50 countries.
And Nirmala Sitharaman, she is the Minister of Commerce and Industry for India, and she's no slacker either. She's been to America alone 3 times just this month, and we are so honored to have you here. Thank you so much. She came in just for the day to show you how honored we should be to have her here. Thank you. So Dom, I first want to put you on the spot because in 2012, when everybody was thinking so highly of emerging markets, you guys put out a study that talked about going for the gold. And now we have a Pew study coming out saying the global middle class is really more of a promise than a reality. And at our MPW Summit, Most Powerful Women Summit a couple weeks ago, there was a lot of concern about capital flight from the developing world. There's a lot of concern about infrastructure. The mood was not what it was in 2002. So I wanted to ask you your opinion on that. But first, can you talk a little bit about how you collect your information when you're on the ground?
Sure. Well, on how to collect information?
Yeah.
Well, on the travels, what I try and do, there's obviously we have client meetings and things like that, but I basically try and make sure, have dinners with a very disparate group of people, a political leader, a journalist, someone from a labor union, just a mix of people to sort of get a feel for what's going on, obviously off the record. And then it's how you actually spend the time during the day. And it's talking, we were talking about this before, John and I, it's with frontline people. It's not just with executives, it's people who are actually trying to make or sell things or working in a factory.
And you're in your hotel room maybe 6 hours.
Yeah,
you're out.
You sleep and go to the gym, and that's basically it.
Yeah.
I think you're out there basically as much as you can. And the recovery time, and I'm sure everyone else here is doing the same thing, is actually on the airplane. But so that's the way to try and pick it up.
And so what are you finding?
But on your point, I mean, clearly, emerging markets are not the darling right now, and there's been about $1 trillion of capital that have left in the last 12 months in emerging markets, which is the biggest, an astonishing number. I think it's the biggest in 37 years. But I'm very, very bullish still on the emerging markets, and the main reason for that is actually back to this middle class thing. We're going to have 2.2 billion new middle-class consumers in the world, primarily in the emerging markets over the next 15 years. And those are primarily in India, China, Indonesia, Africa, which I think we should spend a lot more time talking about it. Nigeria is going to have more babies born in that country than all of Europe combined. And that middle class is not a middle class like a US or Canadian middle class, but it's people with $7,000 of disposable income that we're seeing in it. And it's urbanization that's driving it, and that hasn't stopped. I mean, if I look at China, we spend a lot of time in China, you basically have, you have a constant 20 million people moving from rural areas to cities. During SARS, during H1N1, during the great financial crisis, people moved. The Communist Party tried to stop people from moving, and they don't stop moving. And and China's only 54% urbanized. And so there's a long way to go on that. So again, it isn't, if you take a pinpoint view right now, you'd say it isn't great. But I think you would be doing yourself a disfavor as an organization if you don't think that in the next 15 years, if you are not significantly placed in these markets, you will not be relevant, because that's where the economic power is moving, and it's going to go through ups and downs. But I remain bullish. Maybe again,
And a perfect example of this, you and I were talking backstage about Thailand, where we just were, where there's one thing in the headlines, there's another image you get when you're on the ground. Can you briefly talk about that?
Yeah, I think so. There's some colleagues here from Thailand, from the CEO of PTT, who's here. My image of Thailand, and again, because I used to live a lot for 12 years in Asia, and I find that the difference between when you actually live in a place versus where you travel, the media view is often quite distorted. But people used to say, when you go to Indonesia, what sort of security are you bringing with you? Because this is it's a corrupt, dangerous place. It's been growing beautifully at 6% per year for the last 10 years. But in Bangkok, I must admit, I had a bit of that image. I was going, we've had a military coup. I can't remember how many coups they've had. And what's going on. I had my sense of it was a very downbeat, that from outside, not much happening. And I was there for 3 days, and I got the sense that actually this could be an inflection point. You see business leaders, government, all wanting to work very hard to say, we've got this 15-month window to get a lot of stuff done. We could in infrastructure, on education, on healthcare, and just the kind of the mobilization and seeing ministers, or they weren't the ministers or generals, but the deputy ministers are the sort of the professionals, if you will, driving it. The kind of drive they had to move things and how businesses are trying to move it, the investments that are going on. I came away in a much, much more positive sense than I would have by what I read or what I perceived.
Right. John, same question to you. First, talk about how you collect your information on the ground. And having been through these 50 countries, where do you see, I think you're pretty bullish, you're kind of bullish kind of guy. Where do you see the opportunities that people aren't seeing by just reading the raw numbers?
Well, the first, to get back to one of the points that you made with Dom, you can't define the world based on headlines. I mean, we're in 170 countries, and if all I did was read headlines, we wouldn't be in 100 of them. Yeah. And we'd be depressed all the time. The fact of the matter is that headlines don't tell the story, and as a leader, you have to get in and really figure out what the truth is. And it's always somewhere in between.
Right.
It's never all one way or the other. And I find, like Dom, I travel with the people who actually have to sell the stuff that we make. They can tell you better than just about anybody in the levels between them and me exactly what's good about what we do and what's bad about what we do, and where the bureaucracy is, who are the people that help them win deals, and what are the things that hurt them when they're trying to win deals. And that, to me, is the best source of information. So when I get back to headquarters, and we get into some meeting and we're all postulating about the way things are, I always have a few data points that they're like grounding positions. And I think you got to find your own ways to do that. Everybody does.
And again, where are you finding kind of surprise green shoots?
Well, we've organized our efforts around technology infrastructure businesses for the last 10 years or so. And in a world where, notwithstanding some of the earlier discussions we had today, but 1 billion to 1.5 billion people lack electricity and clean water and health care, there's still plenty of opportunities. There's absolutely no question with oil at 50 versus 100. A lot of economies were built around 100 and now have to adjust to 50. It's harder to get projects moving. It takes a longer time. The need to bring financing in is more relevant, but the nature of what we do hasn't changed. So the green shoots are still there. It's going to take them a little bit longer to grow into full-size plants.
And Madam Minister, yesterday, John Chambers said, among the emerging markets, I'm betting on India. And I think that's a feeling of a lot of people in this room. That said, there is some frustration with the Prime Minister's reforms not moving fast enough. Where does all that stand?
The impression is right. From among the emerging markets, India stands out. Whether you're looking at Brazil, which is probably whose GDP is going to shrink by about 3%. Whether you're looking at Russia, again, about 3 to 4% shrinking of their GDP. South Africa, of course, is not really comfortably placed. India certainly stands out as that one country which is going to be sustaining 7 to 7.5% growth in the next few years, and that's been vouched by IMF, by ever so many studies which have come out in the recent past. And we are aiming to move on to double-digit growth from after the third, fourth year. So with that given, from among the emerging markets, India is going to be the bright star. Yes, you're right in saying the Prime Minister's ambitious reform steps sometimes do get a speed breaker in the Parliament, but we see it as only a little bit of a delay, but we are committed to the reforms and we are pushing ahead. You're right in talking about middle class, not just that kind of a middle class, but middle class which has got disposable income. And I think if some estimates were to be believed, by 2025, you're looking at a $13 trillion middle class market in India. It's just not the middle class which has got the purchasing power, but money being spent both by private and public funding for 175 gigawatts of solar and renewable energy, for which at least $250 billion is what is being budgeted. We are looking also at railways, which is looking at spending about $100 billion in the next 5 years. Major highways and seaport developmental activities have also been listed out. So you're looking at infrastructure, you're right, looking at health, the last mile connectivity in terms of electricity, reaching out to nearly 600,000 villages. The Digital India program has managed to take optical fiber to 2/3 of these 600,000 villages already. And that's the kind of scale that you're talking about when you're talking about digital revolution in India. So if you're talking about infrastructure, roads, bridges, seaports, and renewable electricity, you're also talking about digital connectivity. You're talking about all the Make in India that have brought in a lot of foreign direct investment, whether you're Foxconn or Lenovo or Boeing, people showing interest to come and manufacture India. They're all happening now. So I think from among the emerging markets, the story will be and shall continue to be of India.
So while we're on the topic of India, I wanted to bring in a voice from the audience. Dr. Forbes, who is the president designate of the Confederation of Indian Industry. And Dr. Forbes, go ahead, stand up. And if you could offer your perspective on both the challenges and opportunities that you see coming forward in India.
Well, let me start by saying I appreciate the panel very much. I agree with all the comments. And let me just illustrate, I think, many of the comments that were made with a story. And this is a story, it's one of my favorite stories. It's the story of a security guard in our company who told me a few months ago that his daughter had just graduated from medical school and was starting to practice as a doctor. And his son had just graduated from engineering school and was going to start working for GE as a software engineer in India. And this family income was going from roughly 15,000 rupees a month, or $200 a month, $250 a month, to roughly 150,000 rupees a month, or $2,500 a month. So all of a sudden, in the course of a year, you have a family of, I think, 6 people whose income is being transformed from $250 a month to $2,500 a month. And you suddenly have consumption opportunities for education services, consumption opportunities for consumer goods, for mobile services, for all manner of product. And that's the opportunity, but that's also the challenge. The challenge is that this individual, while not unique, is not yet the median experience in the country. We need to make it the median experience in the country. So we need to spread this opportunity to every one of the 1.3 billion people that we have. and to every one of the 250 million families that we have. And when we can get it to the 250 million families, then we've really got a real dynamo of growth. But that's the opportunity, and that's also the challenge.
So, John and then Dom, what's your perspective on how fast that's happening, what Dr. Forbes described?
Well, I wouldn't say that this comment doesn't necessarily apply just to India, but I don't think in many countries it's happening fast enough. I think there's a level of expectation and accountability that social media and other tools creates and places on governments to move quickly, with the notion of speed being defined differently, just like it is for you and me. I mean, in the 20th century, things were linear and slow, and silos worked, and bureaucracies were okay, and decisions could wend their way up to headquarters. And if that's the way you work today, you will fail. And I think there's an aspect of that applies to governments everywhere. So you have to have bureaucracies that move quickly. People who maybe in the past didn't think they were paid to move quickly or take risks have to be taught and learn that that's the new way. And I think that's a challenge in many countries, including the United States.
Yeah. And Dom, and also, where do you see risk-taking as part of the culture in a way that it needs to be?
Well, what I was just going to say that I do think I love the story, by the way, because I think that does illustrate what the opportunities are and the potential. But we need power, we need energy to be able to use the smartphones that were talked about before. So, Alan's, it's nice to have cheap smartphones, but if you don't have a power source to do it, it doesn't exactly work. And we need that in Africa, and we need that in India. And I do think the bottleneck is government delivery, and it's not. It's that, and I see this in Africa. I remember the Prime Minister of Burkina Faso, not sort of a prime country, we'd say, but he used to run a private equity firm in France, and he said, we can't spend 38% of our funds. We just can't physically get the projects out the door, right? And I think that's the challenge. Is there's lots of good ideas, but how do you drive it through? And one of the challenges I see in China right now is, I actually think the consumer market, the retail market, is actually doing very well. If I just look at the growth rates we're seeing, it's in the SOE side now, which is just clogged up, and a lot of it's. We were talking about this before. I think the anti-corruption drive, which is obviously a very good thing to do, it's cost. We were saying 1% of 1 point of growth. I mean, it could, because people are afraid.
Corruption drive costs 1% of growth.
Well, no, it's the fact that people are very nervous now about making big decisions. Because if you make a big decision and someone doesn't like it in the company, I can say,
you could end up in
had
jail.
that. Yeah, well, you had that dinner the other day with John, and you bought a fairly expensive bottle of wine. I think it might be good for some people to do a little bit of a check.
Yeah.
So who wants that?
Yeah.
And I'm not exact, but so there's I do think this delivery issue is a big one. How do we get more things out the door? And that is taking risks, because people are worried about being put in jail if you don't get it right.
And John, I wanted you to address that, but also in China, there's a lot of concern that with some of these new laws and regulations coming out about NGOs, for example, or national security laws that are in the name of national security that are hurting outside investors and favoring inside companies. What's the investment climate in China?
I honestly don't think it has changed that much. I mean, we worry about laws and regulations everywhere.
Okay.
And China has its share, but we have to think about it in every market that we're in. And frankly, some of the more onerous laws and regulations have come from the developed countries in the last 5 years. So I think a lot is made of the kind of thing, the headlines that you hear about what's going on, not just in China, but
right.
in China. And I think you have to get beneath that, And I think back to the point that was made about the story in India is the real global currency is jobs. If you want to have sustainable, inclusive growth, which in every one of the 50 countries we've visited this year, that's what people talk about. You have to create jobs, and you're not going to create jobs if you don't have basic infrastructure. So you really do, back to Dom's point, there are fundamental building blocks that will allow for wealth to be created and shared the way it needs to be for this world to work right.
So what would you ask, Madam Minister, what do you want to see happen in India first?
Well, and we've talked to the Prime Minister and senior leaders in India about this, moving some big projects forward quickly so that there are very visible signs. We think India is a great place to do business, and it's very interesting that if you go back to the conference 5 years ago, all of the discussion, or a lot of the discussion would have been about the BRICS.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I was around yesterday and today, I didn't hear the term.
And we're going to get to him, though.
Okay. Two are on life support, and we're with one of the shining stars. That's how things can change.
Yeah.
Right? That's how the game changes.
Madam Minister.
One thing which was rightly pointed out is jobs is the currency. And if jobs have to be really emphasized on, in India, not only are we pushing big projects, but we're playing up SMEs. Mm-hmm. The small and medium enterprises are the ones which create, may I say this way, disproportionately more jobs than for the same capex. Mm-hmm. So we've had a tradition of small and medium entrepreneurship. Today, because of Skill India, we are able to get a lot more skilled people to straight be recruited by the SMEs. Earlier, there was a gestation period where many of them coming out of colleges would join them, but may not be employable immediately, but the organizations, small as they may be, would spend time giving them the necessary skills. But because the Prime Minister also, in order to make in India program far more meaningful and effective, brought in the Skill India, which is an initiative to train young graduates who come out of college to be readily employed with particular skills which are required. So we are making sure that set of skills which are required are given in time so that they can immediately get into small and medium enterprises.
And the other piece of the jobs is consumers. And, I think Sheryl Sandberg said, we need to stop looking at people in emerging markets as people who need help. We need to think of them as consumers. What are all of your thoughts on what are those consumers going to look like in 5 years? And how do you approach them through digital channels in a way that we're not thinking about right now?
Well, one thing I would say is that they move very, very quickly. I mean, to say there's a middle class is just too simplistic of a term that we're using. They change on an annual basis. I mean, again, back to the story, look what happens in 1 year. And you look at food purchases, just the type of food purchases. You think you have an angle on someone, it's going to change in a year. So it's a very, very dynamic group that one has to look at. And I think you have to be careful about general terms, like people are brand conscious, people, how they communicate, what matters in terms of quality, because it varies so dramatically even within a country. So if I take China, and I think it might be the case in India too, we'll hear from the minister, but we don't look at China as one market. We think there's 22 clusters of cities where there is quite radically different consumer buying behaviors in that middle class. So you cannot sort of go after that market with one model, and then it changes.
Don't look at a country as one country, or even the big cities, like put together the clusters.
We look at it as sort of clumps or clusters of cities. We'd in fact we'd look at it more as a city approach. That matters more, in fact, than perhaps an overall country
These overlooked
approach.
cities that people
We just don't realize. Yeah.
Well, if you think about China, India, even the United States, these were two-city places for a long time. You had Beijing and Shanghai, you had Delhi and Mumbai, and now it's Delhi, Mumbai, Hyderabad, Pune, Bangalore, and 10 other places that are important to us. Mm-hmm. And all of the chief ministers that we need to understand their priorities and think about their agendas and how they dovetail with the agendas of the central government. And that's what we have to do in 100 countries around the world. And China's another one.
And Madam Minister, tell us something that we don't know about the Indian consumer. And I'm sorry, I'll also interrupt.
Well, I think what we're missing out on is, yes, there are n number of cities, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 cities, but there is a bulk rural consumer. The rural consumer himself, again, are very different from North India, East India, West India. Like you would say, not all cities have the same consuming pattern. Indian rural purchases are also similarly governed by difference in tastes. And as much as cities are important consumer pockets, the rural India are very strong consumers themselves, particularly in durables. Now, even more important is many of them have already moved over to buying online. Buying through phones, not even using their computers to make their purchases. So today, consumer, they're not just buying phones through these online purchases. They're moving on to buying much more valuable goods. So I think in India's consumer profile, you'll have to look at middle class with good purchasing power, middle class which is looking also for branded consumer goods, middle class which is in the rural areas, middle class in the rural areas which also is looking for very good quality goods. They are willing to even import goods. So the diversity of the Indian consumer is one issue, and the size of the Indian consumer spread as they are between cities and rural areas is itself a first big homework any seller will have to look at.
Somebody said recently that India is a continent masquerading as a country, so just to show you the complexity of it. We are going to globetrot. We know we've left some continents behind here, but questions, start getting your questions ready. Let's talk about some of the, well, BRIC and beyond countries, but South America and Latin America. What do you see there?
Well, I think as the minister said, Brazil is, I mean, it's just dumping, if I could, and I think from what I gather, I don't think it's going to be turning around no matter what happens with impeachments or changes that could potentially happen over a 2-year period.
Infrastructure.
I think
they can't get their goods to market.
I mean, I'll let John talk about it. I think it's more just, it's very difficult with all these investigations going on, which are, you know, there's the place is in paralysis, it seems. It's difficult to get things done. There are pockets, have to be careful. There's in parts of the north, actually in cities, again, you've got some very good mayors that are driving things across, but as I didn't know the number, the minus 3% number you were mentioning, but I'm not surprised. In the north, you know, Colombia is a place that I feel very bullish about and where it's going. It's got, you know, hopefully there's a peace agreement. There's a lot of positive things going on, but, you know, Chile has struggled. So the shine is off, or maybe I don't know what will happen in Argentina, but Brazil is the big story that's
John?
Well, I agree with Dom. I think Brazil suffers a little bit from frictional costs and productivity issues and big government in some respects, plus the corruption issues that are well reported, plus oil at $50 a barrel. I mean, so you got a confluence of events that are causing a lot of short-term pain there. It doesn't change our view of Brazil long-term at all. It's still a huge country with big infrastructure needs and lots of natural resources. So the idea that you can forget about Brazil because they're in a recession is, if you do what we do, it's a crazy idea. Like that's not smart business. We have to see it for what it is. In fact, we're looking at opportunities to invest and support our partners in Brazil through this problem, because
So hold your breath and stay in.
you were telling me, right? I think the market cap of Petrobras right now is $25 billion.
It was $25 billion the last time I looked, which probably is a pretty good deal if you think about a national oil company. And you just, if you're in, these are businesses where you have to make long-term decisions, and unfortunately, it's a short-term world. And that's the leadership challenge that we all have, is we gotta fight our way through that.
Forward. Questions? Right here? We've got two right here.
Kathy Bloomgarden, Readership. It's a question for Dom. So you've talked about, you know, several disruptions in China, the anti-corruption drive, the shift to the consumer economy. What about the possibility of innovation focused on science and engineering really bringing a true disruption? Is that possible? And people talk about that. Is that going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a lot of innovation going on in China. It's focused in particular areas. There's actually quite a lot on the industrial side of things. China, I think, is the leading country in terms of just the amount of money that's spent on a GDP basis. I think it's the highest. It doesn't mean it's the best in that way, but typically that's a leading indicator of something that will happen. I think roughly in order of 4 to 5% of GDP that's going in there. And so there is a lot of innovation. I think there's a lot of innovation, particularly we're finding on the consumer side of things, the delivery. If you think about Alibaba and what that's done like in India, that has allowed so many SMEs to participate in the global system. Financial system innovation. If you want to look at fintech, I would make sure you're spending time in China as much as you're spending time here or in Florida. There's an amazing amount of innovation that's going on that front. So on the consumer side, in particular, some of the industrial side, John would know more. But there's a lot, and when you're also pumping out 230,000 engineers, with a master's or PhD level every year in some pretty good universities, that's going to do something.
John, speaking of innovation and China, you've thought a lot about the importance of innovative partnerships in order to do business in China and perhaps in India. I don't know can you give us your thoughts on that?
Well, we think that, and probably if you go back far enough, you would have seen a GE that kind of designed its own solutions to the world's problems. And we realize that today that the problems are bigger and tougher, and we have to partner in order to be successful. So we have to think differently about how we share. So we have 50-50 JVs with state-owned enterprises in some of our most technically sophisticated businesses. We worry...
Do you worry about technology transfer issues?
Well, we worry about technology transfer issues, but not just particularly in China, everywhere. We have to think about intellectual property and cybersecurity everywhere we do business. This notion that cybersecurity is a geographic issue is crazy, right? I mean, you can get into anything from anywhere. So don't define it by a zip code or a postal code, right? But I think that the lesson that we're seeing, we know, and I think a lot of countries are learning, is that innovation can't be indigenous. And there was that term was coined in China a few years ago. There's nothing indigenous about innovation. Everything we do, every jet engine we launch or locomotive or wind turbine is based on inputs from people in multiple countries. We don't do one thing. We have 6,000 engineers in Bangalore working on all sorts of stuff. Their success is partly based on the fact that they're really good people, and partly based on how they plug into a global innovation framework. And that's the way this is going to happen forever. So if you think that it's just about China or just about India or just about Brazil,
right, it's
not. It's this ecosystem.
We had another question right here.
I'm Sunita Sarabji from India West newspaper.
I'm sorry, can you hold your...
Oh, sorry. I'm Sunita Sarabji from India West newspaper, and this question is for you, Madam Secretary. So the Prime Minister's agenda for renewable energy is to get to 175 kilowatts of renewable energy by the year 2020. We currently are at about 2 kilowatts of renewable energy. How do we support this ambitious plan of the Prime Minister? Does India have the resources to be able to do so?
Yes, it is just not a stated policy, but with the state governments in every province, it has been now agreed that every state would make a provision of having at least 5 to 10% of their energy basket derived from renewable energy sources. So if you stated your 175 gigawatts, it's not as if we've just stated the figure and left it at that, but every state with whom the central government is talking has already agreed to have a 5 to 10% mandatory shift to renewable energy. And the central government itself is looking at projects where solar or wind energy programs can be launched within a year or two, and for which there are states identified, land identified, and the program is getting initiated. So that is where that mammoth target doesn't appear as if it's impossible. It is possible to reach.
I'm also intrigued by your smart cities, 100 by 2000.
That's right. It is a project where 100 cities have been identified, some brownfield cities, and some newer ones which are going to come up. Many of the existing cities will have what you may call a twin city attached to it, with all the smartness as would be defined. And the smartness category is going to be defined also by the people who live there, because it is, as we were talking about many of the projects, you may say that a big volume of money is ready for it, but is there an absorption capacity? So each city is also being given the right to decide how far in smartness can they go. So the definition is going to be done by the people together with the local bodies, so they know from where they can start and how far they can reach. So it's not as if one size fits all.
Right.
And also the people's participation is what is going to be making it happen sooner and effectively. So yes, that's a major initiative on which large sums of money will be spent both by public and private partnerships.
Opportunity. We had a question right here. And raise your hand if you want a question so I know.
Thank you. This is actually a question to you. I run an e-commerce company in India, which is my introduction. And you mentioned that about $1 trillion has fled the emerging markets, and you did not give the number for India, but I'm sure that there would be some which came out of India as well. Mention was made by the minister in terms of the fact that India is growing at 7 to 8%, and the World Bank and the IMF have actually substantiated this. And mention was also made that infrastructure which is lacking is something which, if introduced, would lead to future growth. And the minister did mention a number of things which are happening on the infrastructure side. So why did this capital flee India, is my question to you. If all this is happening, is it because of lack of awareness, or is it something else?
Dom?
Well, I think it's something that John meant, is the short-termism. A lot of those are the short-term capital flows. I actually think we're going to see an increase in pension fund investment in India. I know of at least 5 pension funds that are establishing offices. One just did very recently, a Canadian one, because they're there for the long term and they see the opportunity, and that's long-term capital. The challenge is the short-term flows that are moving out, which do affect, exchange rates, balance of payments, inflation, and that's the challenge. So it's short-term money that's moving out of the system as opposed to the long-term money. I wish I could break down exactly where that trillion's coming from in terms of the countries, but my sense is it's very much the short-term flows as opposed to these longer-term ones, and that's a big opportunity. But I think we got to attract that capital.
Short question?
Yeah, short question. My name is Sudhir Mehta from India. My question is on the opportunities in the emerging markets. One of the things which we have been speaking about since yesterday is the unicorns which have come up, and the figure which was mentioned was 147 companies which have generated $1 billion of value or more. The question from an emerging market perspective is we probably need as many companies which are unicorn companies in terms of touching as many consumers. So rather than, let's say, creating a value of $1 billion, how many companies can we generate that can touch 1 billion consumers? And my question to you would be, what is it that the large global corporations are doing to kind of change the paradigm in this?
Well, if I take that question and go back to one of the comments the minister made about the rural, the population that doesn't live in the cities, it has forced us to think differently about infrastructure technology. So it's about distributed power generation. It's about distributed healthcare and the way we develop basic technologies that are fit for purpose for somebody who ultimately is a consumer too, in a rural setting. You know, we didn't really think about that 25 years ago. We were designing big, sophisticated diagnostic imaging equipment for hospitals in developed markets, and then trying to figure out how to cost reduce that so that we might sell 1 or 2 of them in India, right? The new model is totally different. We design in India, for India, the cities and the countryside, and then we think about taking those products to other places.
So we're running out of time. I know we didn't touch on a number of parts of the world, Africa included, but I want to go down the road here and each of you say what you think is sort of a surprise opportunity. What should people be looking at but that they wouldn't normally be looking at? And Madam Minister, you're not allowed to use India. Think outside India, where are some surprise opportunities for investors?
I'm going to focus on Africa because we didn't talk about it, and I would say there are 2 places there. Ethiopia, which is a very large population on the move, a very fast rising middle class, a very different situation than it was 10 years ago. And Nigeria, even with the slowness of the government being formed in the cabinet, I think that's a place that you just can't ignore. Those are 2 countries I would look at.
I'm not going to pick a geography because that would leave somebody out, and I can't do that in my line of business because I love them all. But the digital technology we've been talking about in the last couple of days, you know, we live in a cost per unit world. So if you're an airline, if you buy fuel, if you are extracting, you know, iron ore or copper, it's all about cost per unit. And so you can talk about technology, but it isn't until you get to that cost per unit impact with the shortest transfer function possible. So for us, it creates a real opportunity, and a lot of companies in this room, to take what we've been working on for a while and really bring it to bear when our customers need it the most. You know, with oil at $100 a barrel, it's not as important. With oil at 50, every penny counts in that cost per unit.
Madam Minister, you have the last word.
I would put it in 2 different ways. Sectors, infrastructure, whether you're looking at developed economies like the US, where you have to now rebuild some of the existing infrastructure because they've aged, they're crumbling. Infrastructure again for Africa, which has to start from literally the scratch. So when you talk of infrastructure, it could be not just the roads or bridges, but it could also be working offices. It could be places from where you're going to operate, your hospitals, whatever, asset creation. So your infrastructure is one thing, both for developed world and for Africa. Digitization is the other. And this I was surprised to know, some parts of even United States, which are in the backwaters or interiors, still do not have that much of connectivity, as much as some of my villages.
Interesting.
And if you're talking of Google's balloon technology, Project Loon, I think that's going to also create a lot of revolution. And whether it is in developed economies or in Africa, I'm not talking about India.
Yeah.
So digitization and infrastructure.
And infrastructure. Excellent. Excellent note to end on. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.